is with author and historian Gerald Horne. Now, many thanks for joining us on the programme. It's good to see you. Now, the fighting in Sudan has been raging for 3 days now. No ceasefire in sight. What's your assessment of the current situation there?
Well, it's on a knife's edge, I'm afraid to say. That is to say, scores have been killed, particularly civilians. The dispute arises from the fact that you have these special forces, the so-called RSF, who have been accused of being implicated in human rights violations in the Darfur region, the region of Western Sudan that is larger than Spain. Recall that the International Criminal Court already has called for the extradition of a former Sudanese leader, speaking of Mr. al-Bashir, and there is some fear amongst the RSF that some of their leaders may wind up in the dock. Keep in mind as well that Sudan is strategically sited. Its neighbors include Egypt, which is a close ally of the United States in terms of military alliances. It is also abutting Libya, which was the subject of a NATO and U.S.-sponsored bombing in 2011. Recall as well that in the Central African Republic, due south of Sudan, Washington has become quite hysterical about the role, or the alleged role, I should say, of the Wagner Group, which, as you know, has headquarters in Russia. The United States is not an umpire or a referee, as Secretary of State Blinken was seeming to suggest in the remarks you just played, but it's more like a player. Recall that it was the United States under U.S. President George W. Bush that pushed for the secession of South Sudan, which is awash in petroleum. It successfully seceded from the larger Sudan and has been mired in unrest ever since. Recall as well that some decades ago, in the aftermath of Sudanese independence in the mid-1950s, it was the United States that pushed for the isolation, if not the bludgeoning, of the Sudanese Communist Party, which was seen as inimical to Washington's Cold War ambitions and was a powerful political force. In the wake of the marginalizing of the Sudanese Communist Party, like a seesaw, you saw the arising of a certain religious zealotry, which manifested in the 1990s, particularly when the late Osama bin Laden was said to be residing in the capital Khartoum, which led then U.S. President Mr. Clinton to send cruise missiles into Sudan, supposedly in retaliation, but actually destroying Sudanese manufacturing facilities. So this is a very dire situation that's unfolding, and I think that Washington would be well advised to bow to the influence of the African Union, headquartered in neighboring Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, the 4 dozen plus members of the African Union headquartered in Addis Ababa, rather than interfering in Sudan's internal affairs.
It's interesting that Washington is calling for a chance for civilian rule while everybody else is just calling for a simple ceasefire. Is a transition to civilian rule even a possibility now? And does Sudan actually have some sort of government in waiting?
Well, obviously, Washington's diplomats either are not advising the Secretary of State properly, or there is some sort of hidden agenda, which is often prevalent in the U.S. State Department. Perhaps Washington, as newspaper headlines have suggested, is seeking to cut a deal with one or another faction within the military, and thereby help to further isolate Sudan from its natural allies in the African Union, not to mention its friends in the international community, including Russia and China.
Really appreciate you speaking to us today. Thank you so much for your time. Author and historian Gerald Horne.